Welcome to the Rothermere American Institute Book Club, an event we hold once a term to discuss either a new book or a classic one with a panel of experts. My name is Lloyd Pratt, and I am the Drue Heinz Professor of American Literature. Today, we're going to be discussing Barack Obama's recent A Promised Land, the 700-page first volume of his memoir of his time in the Oval Office, which sold a record-breaking 1.7 million copies in its first week of publication. The format of today's event will run as follows. I'll introduce our three speakers, and then I will pass over to them for remarks on the book. Before I open up the questions to our very large and international audience who are joining us now from across the globe, I will ask them if they would like to ask any questions of each other. Welcome to everyone who's joining us now. We invite you to put your questions into the Q&A function that's on the bottom bar of your Zoom window on the right-hand side. You're welcome to post these questions throughout our panelists' remarks, and we'll cover as many of them as we can during the discussion section of this event. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the RAI Oxford YouTube channel after the event. Without further ado, then I'll introduce our speakers. Jennifer Szalai is currently the nonfiction critic at the New York Times. She was previously an editor at The Book Review and a senior editor at Harper's Magazine. Her work has appeared in Slate, New York Magazine, The New Yorker, Online, and Prospect, among other publications. Robert F. Reid-Pharr is Professor of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at African and African American Studies at Harvard University, a former Drue Heinz Visiting Professor of English at the University of Oxford, and one of the most influential figures in race and sexuality studies. He is the author of 4 books and numerous essays, a recipient of grants and fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. His work has received many honors, including from the Publishing Triangle and the Modern Language Association. In 2015, he was inducted into the Johns Hopkins Society of Scholars, and he was a Guggenheim Fellow in 2016. He's currently at work on a biography of the American writer and activist James Baldwin. Stephen Sarson is Professor of American Civilization at Yale University in Lyon. He has published widely, including in the Journal of Economic History, the William and Mary Quarterly, and the Journal of the Early Republic. His most recent book, Barack Obama, American Historian, published in 2018, was a study of Barack Obama's views on American history from the colonial era to the present, as expressed in his speeches and writings, and his current project is a study of history and historical consciousness in the US Declaration of Independence. Our first speaker this evening will be Jennifer Szalai, and Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Lloyd. Hello, and thank you for joining us. And, I think needless to say, this book, A Promised Land, was highly anticipated. We first received news that Michelle Obama and Barack Obama would be publishing their respective memoirs. I think we learned of this in early 2017, so shortly after Obama left office, and he and Michelle sold their books for an astounding sum, $65 million. And a year and a half later, Michelle published her memoir, Becoming, and people were wondering, where is Barack Obama's book? And he himself says in the beginning of A Promised Land that he thought that it would take him only a year, that he would write 500 pages about his 2 terms in office and be done with it. And yet here we are in 2020. We finally have this book. It's a real door stopper. It's 700 pages, and it only covers his term until May 2011. So not even his entire first term in office. And I think it's interesting to think about this book in several contexts. One of the contexts that we could consider has to do with his previous books. So he published Dreams from My Father in 1995, and that I thought was really an extraordinary memoir. And I think what it does show is the amount of candor that somebody can have when they're not yet a political figure. So this was even before he was a state senator in Illinois. And, I think you see in that book a level of introspection that is really, I think, remarkable, not just in memoirs, but also in the memoir of somebody who did eventually become president of the United States. His next book, The Audacity of Hope, I think was much less interesting from a certain perspective. I think in terms of his political views, it's useful to look at that book, but the book seems very much more of a polished, I'd have to say in some ways more of a canned political product. It includes chapters like values, opportunities, the world beyond our borders. And I think, when I look at this new book, A Promised Land, it contains some of the qualities that I think made Dreams from My Father so interesting. But it also is pushed through the experience of somebody who was president of the United States for 8 years. And not only that, it's clearly written by somebody who was cognizant of the fact that even though he spent his 8 years in office, thinking that part of his job was to try to, as he puts it very explicitly in this book, try to bridge this partisan divide. What ended up happening is that his 8 years in office was followed by the incredibly divisive and polarizing presidency of Donald J. Trump, which was unfathomable before. And so it should be said that the issues that aren't covered in this book include some of the very difficult and trickier aspects of his presidency, including his refusal to hold his own red line in Syria in 2012, his entrenchment of the surveillance state, his decision to put it on even a surer legal footing than his predecessor, George W. Bush, as well as a full and proper discussion of drone strikes, which are mentioned in passing. I will say, though, that I don't see that as a dodge on his part. I think if there's anything that one can say about this first volume is that he does express a real willingness to go into the decisions, many of them unpopular, to also look at the people who criticize them and to, really give the counter arguments like a full voice in this book. And I think that's partly why the book is as long as it is because he really goes deep into process. That said, the book isn't going to satisfy everyone. It hasn't satisfied everyone. Gary Young had an excellent review in The Guardian recently where I think he really wrestled with his own ambivalent feelings about the book, as well as his own very ambivalent feelings about Obama's legacy. And, Young recounts teaching a course in Brooklyn early in Obama's first term about how the media treated Obama. And he ended up having to stop teaching the course in the next semester because his students were completely unwilling to offer even the mildest criticism of the president. And I think what's really interesting to think about now, more than a decade later, is that that's certainly not the case. I mean, I think that when Obama was elected and shortly after he was elected, there was still sort of this hagiographic halo around him that people really looked to him as this new inspiring figure. And I think after 8 years in office, that's bound to change. And so I think it's interesting to think about this book coming out now. And I have been fascinated by the responses to it. I think some people will read it and feel that there's something in it that offers sort of a balm in contrast to the political situation in the US right now, where they see President Obama thinking through his decisions, explaining them, being very deliberate, very methodical. At the same time, I think those qualities are bound to turn other readers off. Um, and I think it's also interesting to think about, and he's come under criticism in response to this book for the way in which maybe those qualities weren't actually suited to the political moment that he was living in. And so I think, it's necessary to think about the length of the book as actually integral to the way in which he wanted to tell the story, which is he makes very clear that he wanted to show what it was like to be president of the United States. And so this issue of process, which I mentioned, comes up again and again. And it actually turns out to be, I think, quite telling and more interesting than it sounds, because he actually shows how the decisions that he made weren't necessarily, they weren't taken in any sort of glib or cavalier manner. I think even his critics would say, okay, he looked at the constellation of possibilities. He just didn't necessarily weigh it in the same way that other people might have. And, when I think of the arc of this book, what's really interesting to me is that you do see the way in which he himself, toward the end of this first term or toward the last years of this first term, he begins to realize that some of the things that he thought were possible um, aren't necessarily possible in the way that he once believed, especially after the Democrats lost decisively the midterms in 2010. And so he had to rely in a way on Republicans who were willing to help him govern, and they simply weren't. They threw up all kinds of obstructionism whenever he tried to implement any sorts of policy changes. So I think you sort of see the arc of his own disillusionment in a way, which I find kind of fascinating. And so I'm very curious to see the next volume or the next two volumes, however many there are when they come out next, and to see how that sort of sense of almost shrinking possibility, what that portends in the future. And I will hand it over to Robert now for his remarks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And let me say before I begin that it's an honor to be in this event at the Rothmere Institute, and I have a very close feeling and wonderful memory of my time at Oxford. I'll say also before I begin that one of the things that I wanted to take my time to do was to talk a little bit about the literariness of Barack Obama's Promised Land, being a recovering English professor. And I had planned to talk about the way in which this work actually fits into a long tradition of African-American memoir, autobiography, and narrative. I ran out of time though. So the truth of the matter is that I would, however, love if people have questions about that and thinking about how Barack Obama's work fits into the long arc, the centuries-long arc of Black writing. I'm perfectly to have that conversation with you. I actually have written out my remarks because we were asked to keep them within 5 to 7 minutes, and I tend to go on otherwise. A Promised Land, the recently published memoir of Barack Bear Obama, 44th President of the United States, is a truly remarkable and indeed historic work. Its prose sings, coming in at 706 pages, chock-a-block full of the details of both Obama's meteoric rise from community organizer to President of the United States, as well as the nuts and bolts sausage-making details of his governance. The work is written in a style that is light, wildly informative, sometimes touching, and often funny. I suspect, in fact, that A Promised Land will be nominated for and perhaps win one or more of the country's most prestigious literary prizes, including the National Book Award and the Pulitzer, or perhaps even the Booker. While President Obama provides readers with some significant details of his personal and family life, particularly his sometimes strained relationship with his wife, Michelle Obama, and his obvious ongoing mourning for his deceased mother and grandparents, the real strength of the work is the way in which he gives us an up-close view of how national and international politics actually work. The bluntness with which he describes his team's handling of the 2008 financial crisis, the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the troop surge in Iraq, and the assassination of Osama bin Laden is at once remarkable and admirable. What truly won me over, however, in a book that I was quite prepared to dislike, was what I will describe as the president's cattiness, his quick, incisive, and deflating descriptions of the persons and personages that he met. Following quick on the heels of a generally positive description of Angela Merkel, whom he met at his first G20 conference, he then described Nicolas Sarkozy as, quote, all emotional outbursts and overblown rhetoric. With his dark, expressive, vaguely Mediterranean features, he was half Hungarian and a quarter Greek Jew, and small stature. He was about 5'5", but wore lifts in his shoes to make himself taller. He looked like a figure out of a Toulouse-Lautrec painting, end quote. In the margin next to this passage, I wrote with a shaking hand, Oh no, he didn't. My great pleasure in reading A Promised Land is tempered, however, by the fact that I still cannot decide whether or not it has arrived to its public, particularly its American public, at the best or the worst moment. As of today, at least 268,000 of my countrymen and women, my compatriots, have died not so much of COVID-19 as of brutish malpractice and dereliction of duty at all levels of government, particularly at the level of the presidency. Meanwhile, the ongoing and frankly white supremacist attacks against Black and brown people by police and many white citizens has continued unabated. The Black Lives Matter uprisings were not, I don't believe, simply another response to this centuries long reality, but instead an indication of an aggressiveness on the part of people of color in this country and elsewhere that is nowhere near abating. I certainly hope not. It is difficult, therefore, for me to square the current situation with the sort of cheerfulness and hopefulness on the part of the president in relation to what he takes to be essential American traits of fairness and practicality. He writes, I hadn't run simply to fan anger and allocate blame. I had run to rebuild the American people's trust, not just in the government, but in one another. If we trusted one another, democracy worked. If we trusted one another, the social compact held, and we could solve big problems like wage stagnation and declining retirement security. He then goes on to say, still, this is another passage, and a second passage. Still, to a degree unmatched by any superpower in history, America chose to bind itself to a set of international laws, rules, and norms. More often than not, we exercised a degree of restraint in our dealings with smaller, weaker nations, relying less on threats and coercion to maintain a global pact. Over time, that willingness to act on behalf of a common good, even if imperfectly, strengthened rather than diminished our influence, contributing to the system's overall durability. And if America was not always universally loved, we were at least respected and not merely feared. To be blunt, as much as I enjoy and broadly celebrate A Promised Land, and as much as I revere President Obama, I find his language here tinny and more than a bit out of touch. The world is afraid. Americans are particularly afraid, having bought over the last months an historic amount of handguns and other weapons to protect themselves from Americans. Even more telling, the shocking uptick in arms sales has been driven by women, people of color, and progressives, political progressives, who fear that they are no longer safe in the streets. Indeed, because of COVID and many other factors, they are not safe in the streets. Thus, the criticism that I will make of President Obama as a writer is that while he is as fine a prose stylist as there is, he is lacking as a poet. When he speaks of the beauty of the American people, he almost always treats us in the aggregate, referring to campaign bromides of stories that he has heard from thousands of people in his travels, or views of the world taken literally from the vantage point of Black Hawk helicopters and Air Force One. I'll move on, however, and end by saying that I would make one piece of advice to the president, writer to writer, American patriot to American patriot. And that is, I have to say, not that the president is in fact asking for my advice, but I'll give it anyway. And that is that he needs to push decidedly outside of his comfort zone. We need his practicality. We need it now more than ever, and we need it in all things. We particularly need a bluntly sober assessment of what he names American exceptionalism, an idea that about which I chafe and many Americans chafe, many people in the world chafe, but that the president defends throughout and repeatedly in A Promised Land. We need an assessment of American exceptionalism, though, that is capable of moving us all forward in these difficult times. Thank you, and I will pass on to Stephen Sarson.
I think my computer has malfunctioned somehow. I don't know if you can hear me or not.
You're fine,
Okay.
Stephen, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so that was interesting, Robert. Thank you very much. I actually have, as you'll see emerge from my talk, a slightly different view. I think that President Obama has sort of shifted in his thinking about America. He has not, as you say, Robert, abandoned American exceptionalism, but I think he's heading in that direction. Anyway, I too have a script here written, so I hope you don't mind me sort of glancing down at it. There's a lot of quotes, so I'll be referring to those quite frequently, and we'll have to read them a little bit. So I'm here because I've worked on Barack Obama as a historian and how Obama's sense of history has guided his intellectual development. So when I read Carlos Lozada's review of A Promised Land in the New York Times, I was kind of alarmed. Lozada wanted, he said, to grab a red pen and slash out lines where Obama overdoes the history lessons, and complained that for Obama, just about every moment is a teachable one. Now, it's an otherwise brilliant review, but I do believe that Mr. Lozada is wrong here. For Obama, every moment is not so much a teachable moment as a learnable one. Now, it's not that the lessons that Lozada complains about are just for us, the readers. They are lessons learned by the author, Obama. If they're lessons there at all, then they're lessons for us in how Obama thinks, and therefore they're relevant. The long forays in A Promised Land into the history of domestic policy are there because Obama wants to explain to us his own economic and social policies. The histories of other countries are there because Obama wants to explain to us the context of his foreign policy. But history is also there for a deeper reason, not just to explain particular decisions about this or about that, but to explain to us what he thinks America is and what it means. A constant refrain in his writings and speeches, both before and during most of his presidency, is a sort of idea, a Whiggish idea, to use the historiographical term, of progress. And it's a teleological history too, one emanating from his notion of the Declaration of Independence promises of equality and liberty as a creed that has been made ever more real by the we the people created by a constitution that, in Obama's view, provided a framework to make progress happen. And this is how Obama actually defines his American exceptionalism, which Robert was talking about. Now, in this context, Obama never ignored slavery, Jim Crow, other injustices, never denied that it was a struggle to achieve progress, never said it was linear, always said things went backwards, and has never denied that America has some way to go. But the emphasis was always on progress, and he always liked to quote Martin Luther King, quoting the abolitionist Theodore Parker. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And these are the guiding principles that explain, overall principles that explain Obama's decisions and are repeated throughout the book and help explain why he did this and why he did that. It's not just about what Franklin Roosevelt did, it's about the sort of longer term picture. But what's also clear in A Promised Land, and here's where I differ a little bit from Robert, is a darker picture of American history than Obama has ever painted before. The title, A Promised Land, is of course borrowed from the Jewish story of escape from slavery that was borrowed by African Americans dreaming of their own escape from slavery. A story of liberation, very much in the Obama old tradition. And Obama reminds us in this book, in A Promised Land, that the civil rights leader, Reverend Otis Moss, told Obama that he, Obama, was of the Joshua generation and could, quote, lead our people and this country out of the wilderness. Now, the tragedy at the heart of the book of A Promised Land is that this does not happen, and Obama is very aware of it. And it is the disillusionment that Jennifer was talking about earlier. The first, excuse me, indication of this in the book is in the epigraph, which cites the words from the African-American spiritual about Promised Land. It cites the words fly and never tire 3 times before saying there's a camp meeting in the Promised Land. So this book is not about actually emerging from the wilderness into the Promised Land. It's really about the struggle of still being in it, of still being in the wilderness and trying to reach that Promised Land. And as Obama says in the introduction, I think he makes it clear there, he says, our democracy seems to be teetering on the brink of a crisis rooted in a fundamental contest between 2 opposing visions of what America is and should be. This contest is not new, of course, he continued. In many ways, he says, it has defined the American experience. And he then cites slavery, Jim Crow, and other iniquities that he's talked about before. But this time, the framing of the contest is different. Rather than a single egalitarian vision of America that gradually erodes inegalitarian inheritances from the past that are implicitly not American, he now writes of 2 opposing competing visions, a darker contest, and one apparently with a less predefined outcome. And one of the many passages that struck me to that effect is as follows. When President Obama was reflecting on the controversy early in his time in office over his own comments concerning the arrest of Robert's colleague at Harvard, the great African-American scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr., arrested outside his home for apparently breaking in, which he was clearly not doing. Obama says, it seemed to tap into some of our deepest undercurrents of our nation's psyche, touching on the rawest of nerves, reminding all of us, black and white alike, that the basis of our nation's order had never simply been about consent, that it was also about centuries of state-sponsored violence by whites against black and brown people, and that who controlled the legally sanctioned violence, how it was wielded against whom, still mattered in the recesses of our tribal minds much more than we cared to admit. Now, of course, it's possible that Obama had previously deliberately lightened up his views of American history in order to appeal to voters and unify different populations that Robert talked about. And he indicated in A Promised Land that this is partly the case. I'll just give one example. As the Jeremiah Wright controversy of 2008 arose, he says that a part of me was, at the time, frustrated with the constant need to suffer for white folks' benefit the blunt truths about race in this country as a matter of practical politics. But there are also indications that Obama has changed his views as a consequence of his relatively recent experiences, this arc of disillusionment that Jennifer mentioned. Another striking passage to me comes on page 131, where Obama explains with his mixed background and experience, he had never felt what W.E.B. Du Bois called Black people's double consciousness. He'd experienced discrimination, he explains, yet at no point had I ever questioned or had others question my fundamental Americanness. But then, Obama adds, of course, I had never run for president before. And that's where the change of heart seems to begin. Of the 2007-8 campaign, he said, there were claims I wasn't an American citizen. But there were also claims that had nothing to do with my nationality, but everything to do with a foreignness of more familiar, homegrown, dark-hued variety, that I dealt drugs, worked as a gay prostitute, had Marxist ties, fathered multiple children out of wedlock, all these racist tropes. Of Sarah Palin, Obama says this: through Palin, it seemed as if the dark spirits that had long been lurking on the edges of the modern Republican Party, xenophobia, anti-intellectualism, paranoid conspiracy theories, and antipathy toward Black and brown folks, were finding their way to center stage. And of course, all that culminates with Trump. Late in the book, he describes an emotional, almost visceral reaction to my presidency. It was as if, he says, my very presence in the White House had triggered a deep-seated panic, a sense that the natural order had been disrupted, which is exactly what Donald Trump understood, Obama continues. Quote, when he started peddling assertions that I'd not been born in the United States and was thus an illegitimate president. For millions of Americans spooked by a Black man in the White House, he promised an elixir for their racial anxiety. The book then culminates, and I will soon, in just a few seconds, the book culminates in a final chapter with two narratives. Now, throughout the book, Obama, ever the consummate writer, alternates between different stories, often contrasting ones, a political triumph here, a failure there, exhausting legislative process here, family time there. But the two that dominate the final chapter, they are similar but also contrasting. One concerns Trump, not just his birtherism and other outlandish claims about Obama, but also the beginning of his campaign for the presidency, something that's obviously going to feature in the second volume. The other narrative that dominates equally concerns the build-up to and the killing of Osama bin Laden. And the cause, perhaps, of Obama's new pessimism is that of these two threats to American democracy, he could only extinguish one of them. And there we are. I will stop at that point and hope we can go over to discussion and questions. So I hand back over to Lloyd.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Robert and Jennifer. If Robert and Jennifer would like to rejoin us now. Thank you. I wanted to ask if the three of you, if you had any questions for each other or comments that you wanted to make on each other's presentations so far. You're not required to do that. I have questions that I can add in, but please do go ahead if there's anything you'd like to say. And to the people who are listening at home or in your offices or wherever you might be, if you see the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen, do feel free to start filling in that area with questions. We've already got a couple coming in, so please do feed them to us as quickly as you can think of them. But I'll ask you guys, do you have anything that you wanted to respond with?
I'll say to both. No, please.
Robert first.
I'll say to both Stephen and Jennifer and to you, Lloyd, wise man that you are, that's interesting because I think that Stephen and I are in fact on two sides of the same coin. Because in fact, I agree that one of the things that's interesting, very, very interesting about A Promised Land is that Barack Obama is blunt and is more blunt than I think that he was during his presidency. It's not sort of my problem. The problem that I have is that I actually think that what he did in 2008 was to give the entire country a sense of remarkable hope in a sense that we in fact are one people. That is a difficult thing to do in the United States. I just don't know that the way in which he frames this work rhetorically can get into the nitty-gritty of what we're in now. It seems, in fact, to me, to float above our population, to be concerned with us as an aggregate, and to be concerned with ideals that are timeless. There's a moment in which he talks about going to the pyramids in Egypt, and he sees an image on the pyramids that looks just like him, and then he imagines who this person could have been, and that person, in fact, ends, and then he ends by saying, well, all things end as I will end. I get the rhetoric. It's so beautiful. But there's not a single person in the US today, certainly not in New York City, where we can't leave our houses, the schools have been closed, who want to hear about, well, all things come to an end. What we want to know is how we can trust our neighbor and how we can actually comfortably drive our car from the state of New York to the state of North Carolina. That's literally, that is the conversation that people have today. And how we can trust, New Yorkers can trust North Carolinians. I'm a New Yorker and a North Carolinian, so I'm sensitive to it. And so that question, I think he doesn't scratch the surface on. I think he floats away from us versus saying, look, this is what the reality is. We have to get into it and we have to get hard notes about it.
Jennifer or Steve, did you want to respond?
Yeah,
Jennifer, you look like you have a response.
My
Sorry,
connection froze at the end there, so I didn't catch the very end of what Robert was saying. Yeah, okay, yeah, I get your point. I guess he, and in turn me reading him, are thinking of the longer term. I mean, of course, you're absolutely right that right now the United States, like much of the world, is in a state of crisis over the pandemic, and there are crises of other kinds. But I guess the answer to that is, well, yes, this is true. But part of that is the fault of the issues that Obama himself is talking about the anti-scientism of Donald Trump and these other kinds of recent or revived historical trends that cause distrust and division between people. I mean, if Donald Trump had trusted science, then America would be in a better place, the world would be in a better place in terms of COVID and these other, not to minimize these problems, but these are the more passing problems, whereas you know, the kinds of problems he's talking about the lack of honesty, about the sheer oppositionism, about racism, are sort of more existential, as it were, and more long-term, I suppose. So I think you're right. It's two sides of the same coin here. And I'm sorry if I don't address what you said at the end, but I just didn't hear it because of
I was making a
issues.
very beautiful point about the relationship between the state of North Carolina and the state of
right. Okay.
It was positively lyrical. Jennifer, did you want to? Jennifer,
Yeah,
did you want to respond? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, so first, I just wanted to make a clarification. Steve, in your remarks, you mentioned Carlos Lozada's review, and it was actually not for the New York Times. It was for the Washington Post.
I'm
So
sorry.
just for people who want to look it up, actually, I think it's worth
Right.
people, you know, looking up the various reviews just to see how people have responded in very different ways to this book. And, you know, Robert, what you were saying, I think, about the sort of overall sense of timelessness in this book, I think is actually a fascinating point. Because I have to say, I think we learned, it was in September that we learned that the book was finally arriving, that Obama had finally finished it, and that it was going to be published. I think the date was November 17th. So that's 2 weeks after this election was about to happen, and nobody knew what was going to happen. And, you know, frankly, right now in the United States, I mean, in several parts of the world, but in the United States, I mean, it's a state of emergency when it comes to the pandemic, in addition to other issues. And I think it sort of does cut to the heart of the varying responses to this book, because I think that Obama is such a good, clear prose stylist. I mean, there's like a clarity to his writing, which is really, I think, for anybody who tries to write, you know, people will be impressed by, regardless of what you think of his politics. But I think, yeah, this question of the moment that we're living in, I think goes to the heart of what we expect, I think, from books, especially at this time, what we expect from President Obama as, you know, an esteemed political figure who, you know, can speak to a wide audience. And, you know, I think it is really interesting. I was listening to Robert's comments as well as Steve's comments, and it did seem very clear to me that they were reading the exact same book. I mean, it wasn't like there was like a wholesale, totally, you know, and sometimes that does happen with certain books where it's like people don't seem to see eye to eye in terms of what they're actually reading. But in this case, there's so much in this book. It's so detailed. It's so long in terms of how minutely he goes into his own decision-making process, that there's all the things that both Robert and Stephen have talked about. And I think, to me, it does sort of also go to a question of emphasis, because there are certain parts of the book where he is very blunt about the history of the United States, the history of racism, the racism that's embedded in the institutions. And so to me, I did sort of see this arc, an arc of disillusionment, maybe that's not quite fulfilled by the end, but it's moving there. But at the same time, Robert, I think you're exactly right. There is this sort of above it all quality. And I like that you brought up that, where he looks at that image on the wall where I think it's in Egypt. Is that where he is? Where he sees it and he imagines himself into the life of this person that he doesn't even know if they even existed. He doesn't even know what the history of the image is, but he just sort of thinks in this very abstract way of what it must be like to be that person. And then in the end, we're all dust. And that's true. But what are we supposed to do with that? Are we supposed to reflect on our own mortality? That's fine. But I think at this particular moment, a lot of people will have questions. Okay, well, I'm reading this. This is interesting and this is beautifully done. But what does this mean? And I think, that does raise the question, are we putting sort of, what kind of expectations do we have for a book like this?
I mean, I think that what you've got to, Jennifer, I think is something that comes up very clearly across the narrative, which is that at some level, it feels like a refusal of the deification of Obama, and also a kind of pushing back against people and saying there are individuals who are making choices. This is not just about me. There are individuals who are responsible for making key choices about how we live our lives. And the desire to have me fulfill the role of the person who unites everyone is a problem. And there's even a moment that I think is very important in the book where he essentially says that one of the most hubristic moments he had was the moment where he imagined that he could be a kind of Whitmanian and embody all races, all people, and paper over the divisions of race that ran through the United States. It feels to me a little bit, Robert, like part of the reason that voice that would unify is not there is because it's almost as though there's a racial awakening that happens the moment he becomes president and the moment he realizes how deeply embedded these divisions are within the United States. There's also an interesting moment where he talks about the Gates arrest, and he has this thing where he says, for just about every Black man in the country and every woman who loved a Black man and every parent of a Black boy, it was not a matter of paranoia or playing the race card or disrespecting law enforcement to conclude that whatever else had happened that day in Cambridge, this much was almost certainly true. A wealthy, famous, 5'6", 140-pound, 58-year-old white Harvard professor who walked with a cane because of a childhood leg injury would not have been handcuffed and taken down to the station merely for being rude to a cop who'd forced him to produce some form of identification while standing on his own damn property. Now, the thing that's interesting to me about that moment is it's not entirely clear to me whether that's Obama's voice or not. And there's a way that he sets it up where it's not entirely clear whether he now understands that voice as his own or whether he is still sort of at some kind of distance from it. So we have several questions coming in the chat over here in the Q&A. And there are a couple of that have come in asking actually about, Robert, what you suggested you might be willing to talk about, which is just essentially the place of this book in the African-American tradition of autobiography, of memoir. People are mentioning Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and there are, of course, others in this tradition. So I wonder if you might speak about that for just a minute.
Well, I will speak about it at my peril because there's a massive tradition of African-American narrative, memoir, and autobiography. And I will say before I begin that I will mention one. And that is, I'm really, and I mean to say it with really grand respect. And also, I just like to repeat, I really enjoyed A Promised Land. I really did, for a variety of reasons. But I saw it immediately in relation to Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. And I'll tell you why. That Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery was written at the turn of the 20th century, published at the turn of the 20th century. Booker T. Washington was himself a mixed race person, and he was at the time of the publication of that memoir, the most powerful Black person in the United States, and remained so during his lifetime. Now, Booker T. Washington, part of the reason I want to be careful is because Booker T. Washington was an apologist for segregation. And I'm not saying at all that that's true of Barack Obama. As a matter of fact, I think that his several memoirs have in fact been really about refusing the idea that American people have to maintain racial distinction. That his own part of the reason we're so compelled by his biography is in fact that he was raised in Hawaii, also already the state outside of the Black-white divide in this country, and also he is a person who had an African father and a mother with Kansas roots. What's amazing about both of them, however, and what is so compelling about this work, and what is really quite compelling about Barack Obama, is his patriotism. This is a man who, in the face of everything that we can say about the United States, has zero problem saying that he is a patriot and that he loves the United States. That is a difficult thing for a modern Black person to say in these United States of America. And by the way, not a thing that the whole of the Black community is going to smile about. But he does it, and he actually works through a tradition of Black writing that also I think would include Frederick Douglass, certainly includes Martin Luther King, in which they're at the core of Black thought, or a significant center of Black thought. There have been leader after leader, memoirist after memoirist, who has said at the end of the day that in fact, I'm a person who is a Black person and fully American, in the way that Barack Obama does that. That is a little bit, that's a center. It is not the only center of Black thought. It is in fact a quite brave thing for him to be doing. And so again, I'll say in relation to the conversation that Stephen and Jennifer and I have been having, that it's not that I'm hostile to that idea, is that I want a bit more meat on the bones, and I want to know, I want him to get into the mix about that ideology, in the same way that he very, very, very successfully gets into the mix of how you run a campaign and how you actually get get legislation through Congress, how you actually govern. I just think that right now, at this, not even I think it, I know that at this moment, there is a significant minority of persons in this country who in fact feels like maybe we have been wrong to be so steadfast in our defense of the place, to be so absolutely certain that we are at the center of what the country is, and that our community and our beliefs are going to win, and that we're going to win it for everybody, no matter whether or not their skin is pink or brown or dark black. My hesitation with Barack Obama, actually not with Barack Obama, with the Promised Land, is that I wish that I could get some more instruction on that. I'll keep coming back to that. I wish that, my fear is that that what will happen with this book is that people will buy it and put it on their shelves, literally next to pictures of Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, and turn it into an icon, because we love Barack Obama. I love Barack Obama. I very much like Barack Obama. I love Michelle Obama, you know, and that we will turn this volume, this thick volume, 706 pages. I don't know about you guys, but 706 pages was a little hard in a week. That we will put that on a shelf and turn it into a thing that we genuflect towards, but that we don't take seriously as a piece of political history, cultural history, social history. I guess that's all I'll say. I mean, I could ask more, if people want to ask me more specific questions about the things that I know.
I think Steve wants to say something, but I wanted to say one quick thing is that, Robert, what you just described, that kind of this relationship to the figure of the United States, the question of patriotism, anti-patriotism, in a way identifying or disidentifying with the United States. It's a very, as you well know, it's a very long part of the African-American literary tradition. Which side do you fall on that question? Are you Martin Delany or are you Frederick Douglass? Are you Douglass or are you William Lloyd Garrison? So there's that kind of train of wondering where you fit in relation to the United States comes back again and again and again in African-American literature.
You could not, I think that you couldn't be more, couldn't be more clever in saying, thank you for saying that. My fear as a citizen and as a creative person is that I'm not certain that the narratives that have been received by my generation of Black persons will be functional in the 21st century, especially after Trump, and especially after a sense of a near universal sense of having been insulted and assaulted by the executive branch of the United States. That changes things. It's unfair to say to Barack Obama, it's your job to fix it. But it is totally fair to say to Barack Obama, if we're talking about him now as a writer, that it's your job to engage it and to engage in that process. He has very little sense of himself in the long tradition of African American writing, except for, I know that Stephen's going to say this, except for he specifically says that he's not W.E.B. Du Bois. But the truth of the matter is that we need him to take that mantle and to show us how it can be done.
Volume 2. Steve, and then if Jennifer wants to respond.
Yeah, my little point here was, it was something that I thought of when Jennifer was talking, it's just come back as Robert was talking. Isn't what Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass and Barack Obama have in common is a dual concept of time? I hate to sound like a historian all over and over again, but I think it was in the A More Perfect Union speech, Obama talked about the timelessness of our ideals and the realities of their time. He was talking about the founders and then generations since who have always adhered to the timelessness of ideas and the realities of their time. And isn't that the kind of issue that we're talking about here, is a dual concept of time? If you hold to the one time, then, you know, the eternal sort of concept of time that rests on the ideas of the creed of the Declaration that all these men talked about, then that's one thing, and that can be a source of patriotism, a source of hope, no matter what is happening in the reality of one time, whether that be now with COVID or whether that be the times of slavery or the times of segregation. So I think it rests on concepts of time, is all I wanted to say, or suggest.
For the entire population, by the way. American people are obsessed with whether or not we follow the strictures of the founders, or whether or not we do something else, or what the strictures of the founders actually were. We're all obsessed by people. The young country is rapidly aging.
I know.
Jennifer.
Well, I think, you know, it's interesting. Lloyd, you mentioned, and I think Steve, you also mentioned in your comments, the issue with Henry Louis Gates Jr. and, you know, the political fallout from that, which Obama goes into the book, and the way he describes it is that he himself, you know, he doesn't describe himself as that surprised in the book at many moments, but that's one of the times when he commented, I think right after the event, he said that the police officer behaved stupidly, which, you know, to my mind sounds like a very, I mean, it's very mild. It's not a very deep criticism, but that remark, you know, his approval rating among white Americans apparently plunged further than it did at any other point in his presidency. That one remark in response to that event, he himself was shocked. And, you know, I think it's interesting to think about how he obviously deliberately ended his book at the moment when he did. And I think, Steve, it is interesting to look at those two trajectories, the triumph of the killing of Osama bin Laden on the one hand, and then the bubbling up of the birtherist conspiracy with Trump on the other. And you sort of see these things can go in sort of different directions. And I do wonder, you know, I recently did a podcast segment with one of my colleagues for the book review podcast for the Times, and Dwight Garner, he mentioned, and I thought that this was a smart comment, where he said, there's something shrewd maybe about this decision to stop the book where he did, because now he can work on the next volume while taking into account, first of all, whether or not Trump won the election, which he didn't. So now he can take into account the whole 4 years of the Trump presidency, and he himself can really try to reckon with that maybe in the next volume. And so I realized that it feels there's something a little disorienting about reading this book now, something that was completed before the 2020 election, that was written. And as I said before, really arrives, I think, at a state of emergency for the country. But at the same time, now he's sort of bought himself time to to really work through maybe some of the issues that, we've been talking about here, where he can maybe adjust his perspective accordingly. Because I do think that, like many people in 2016, even though he was, I think, appalled by what he saw in Trump, he didn't think that he would necessarily win the presidency. And then he did. And, that's the kind of event that should change one's perspective of what reality looks like. And I think that if any politician has shown himself willing to sort of reconsider his views, he is somebody who has done that. And so I am, as I said, very curious to see what happens in the next volume.
I mean, I feel like one of the things that certainly I'm waiting for, and I think probably some other people are waiting for, is the great Jeremiad that will bring us back together again, right? I mean, that's one of the conventional functions. The Jeremiad in American history has always been there to reunify us at the moment where we've fallen apart. And we haven't had one. And we're probably not going to have one for at least another few months until there's some sign that we are back on a normal track of some kind. But there is something that is not here. It's not a Jeremiad. And in fact, there are sort of two chapters right next to each other. I noticed that one of them is, or two sections. There's the part 2, Yes, We Can. And then there's part 4, The Good Fight. And then there's part 5, The World as It Is. And that is a little bit, it's not an optimistic unifying force, or it feels like a grappling with a kind of pragmatic history, a pragmatic need that's confronting people. I wanted to actually turn to one of the questions that came in from Lyon, from your home university, Steve. Okay. I think it's a really interesting question from a student there. And her question is that, she says that, do you think the division, so Obama talks about the US being divided throughout the book, as we know. And her question is, do you think the division is the same division as the US experienced during the recent US election? Which I think is actually a very smart question to ask, because part of what Obama seems to be getting at in this narrative is that something changed, that either there was a division, and this is, I think, one of the questions we all grapple with when we look at American politics is, are these moments where what seems to be a division comes into focus, is it a new division? Is it something that was generated, as he seems to suggest at certain moments, by the naming of Sarah Palin as a vice presidential candidate? Or was that merely a kind of uncovering of a division that was always there? And is that now the same division we're dealing with now at this point? Because there seems to be some tension in the book about whether this is just America as it has always been, or this is America after Fox News, after the rise of the sort of Palin populists. And the idea, so it's not really clear whether this is a historical event of a new set of divisions and whether we might have new ones now, or whether this is just America as it's been for the past 2 centuries. So what do you think? Is this the same division or a new one or different?
Who gets to go first on that one?
Let's give it to Jennifer.
Okay.
I mean, I got the sense from the book that he's aware of that there are divisions. I mean, he explicitly says that he was elected. I mean, it's worth remembering that in 2008, Obama was not the establishment candidate. He was, his political career at that point was relatively short. He was somebody who was very publicly against the Iraq War before he became a senator, a United States senator. And so I think, he realized at the time that Americans wanted something different. They wanted change, which was part of his platform. I think, though, that as you read the book, you get the sense that even though he was aware of the divisions that existed, there are certain points where he's surprised by how other establishment figures, especially among the Republicans, are willing to sort of exacerbate already existing divisions. And instead of trying to help him bridge this divide that he says that he was elected to help bridge, that in fact they're going to use it politically as a weapon. And I think one of the frustrating things that people experienced during the Obama presidency, and I think that people experience when reading this book, at least when I've read the reviews in response to it, is, here's somebody who keeps sort of plugging away at politics in such a way that actually reflects a version of politics that was already on its way out at that point. And he's aware that Palin, signaled something and she exacerbated something. The Tea Party, the same thing. The birtherist conspiracies, the same thing. But still, in 2011, when Donald Trump was peddling his birtherist conspiracy theories, I think at the time, Obama says, like so many other people, he thought it was a joke. I mean, it just sounded so outlandish, and that it did play to something real. I mean, he does say that as a Black man in the United States, he's aware of the racism that exists, but I think that I'm not sure what he would say in the next volume, but if I were to look at the divisions in the country, they were already there 12 years ago. It's just, the institutions were sort of arranged differently. And I also think that the Republicans, like if you read other books about what happened in 2008, the Republican response was that they really panicked with Obama. That they saw, here's this figure who apparently can get a wide variety of people to vote for him. And they didn't know what to do. I mean, they were in the position of becoming a minority party, which is essentially where they're at. I mean, they're able to lose popular elections, but, in 2016, win the Electoral College votes. So they figured out that they needed to fight him at all costs. And they were going to use whatever they could. And if that required, encouraging birtherist conspiracy theories, here we are. I mean, here we are in 2020.
Here we are. Robert, did you want to speak, and then we'll go to Steve?
Well, Steve, you go first. Go.
Are you sure? Okay, that's okay, thank you. My view on it is fairly short, I think, and that is, I think what Obama does is sees the divisions as basically the same. You're either in favor of the creed of equality and liberty or you're against it. And it is quite binary. And those divisions have always been there, or that's in his new version of history. So to that extent, I think it's a great question, by the way. To that extent, the new divisions are the same as the old. But I think what Obama worries about a great deal, rightly or wrongly, and I think he exaggerates it, but it is a real issue, is tactical. What the opponents of equality, liberty, and the American way, as Obama sees it, do now, more than they ever did before, in his view, is lie. And the means for their lying is much more, he always used to say you can rely on each other's good faith, even if you didn't agree. He seems to have dropped the notion now that you can rely on your political opponent's good faith, and he's seen so much lying. And it's also not just about the lying, but about the freedom to lie. Obama seems to believe, and I think he exaggerates this, that the press now gives lies a new equivalency to what, whereas they used to sort of chase the truth, now they present lies as opinions and this kind of thing. And it's also exacerbated, he thinks, by social media and its divisive, it's an inherently, he seems to believe, divisive kind of media. And it also spreads disinformation much more quickly. And there's so much of it, so much information out there, that how are people supposed to sift the truth from the lies? Now, I don't know about this. I'm not a media expert, but that I think is what Obama thinks, that it's about mediation. It's about who lies and what people are prepared to do and how they're able to do it. On the other hand, perhaps someone more expert than me can talk about this. It's a long time ago that Mark Twain, I think, said something to the effect of, you know, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. So I don't know how right he is, but I think that's how he sees the differences and the similarities between past conflict and present.
I agree with both what Steve has just said and also what Jennifer has said. Super smart, super clever. I just want to add a wrinkle to this. And that is that often I think that when American people and when Europeans talking about the United States talk about division, they are often sort of talking about a black-white division between native-born white persons and native-born black persons. But you have to remember there has been, certainly after World War II and really after 1964, a massive demographic change in the United States. We should remember that when Barack Obama was first elected to the Senate and then when he ran for the presidency, there wasn't an immediate acceptance of Barack Obama without an African-American parent by African-American people. That in fact, he was the child of a white American woman and an African immigrant. You should remember, if my understanding is correct, that between 1964, and I think that that's when the Immigration and Naturalization Act was passed, and I believe 1991, more Africans immigrated to the United States than during the entire period of enslavement. And so you're talking about, that's a major change in the US. And I said before that I'm from North Carolina. North Carolina, when I was growing up, had two ethnic groups, country and small town black people and country and small town white people. It now has one of the largest Mexican and Central American populations in the US. I think maybe the fourth broadest in the US. Donald Trump cut his teeth on anti-immigrant fervor as well. So part of what's happening is that there are divisions built on enslavement and segregation. That's the truth. That's basic to the US. But also, we're all swimming in new waters. It's difficult for us to understand how it is that things are going to line up or not in terms of our politics and in terms of our identities. I'll say just two quick things about that. One is that Joe Biden won the state of Georgia, Black and Asian already, Black and Asian, daughter of two immigrants as his running mate. The state of Georgia, he won it. He won the state of Virginia, he won it. Partially because those states are, not even partially, because those states are in rapid change. Globalization happens there and especially happens in those places. He could have won the state of North Carolina. You know, so that says that what we think of as the South is also wildly changing. Where we think conservatism actually is wildly changing. Where we think is liberal is wildly changing. And the Midwest is probably no more to the left than the South is. The West certainly isn't. And then the second thing is, you know, the growing Latino population, Hispanic population in the United States is a concern in both parties, and I think a real hope for our country. I'm very proud of that fact. But what we think of as Hispanic and Latino is also divided. So that Joe Biden lost and Donald Trump won in very heavily Latino and Hispanic Florida. But the Latino and Hispanic vote actually helped to push him over the edge in Nevada, Arizona. You know, so we're this dynamic place built on a legacy of slavery and a legacy of segregation that we sometimes understand and that we sometimes don't. But part of what the anxiety is in the country is that our cities look a lot different, our institutions look a lot different. Who gets to speak looks a lot different. Who gets elected to Congress looks a lot different. And the ways in which we actually don't have a very well-developed vocabulary to allow us to embrace one another, because in fact, very often we just don't know that much about each other, or we don't have a long history of engagement. And that I think that one of the things I hope that the president helped to do, but I hope that we're going to do in the next election, is actually figure out how to have those types of hand-to-hand conversation that Barack Obama is such a fan of, but that we haven't actually put into place I don't think that we have put enough into place enough the protocols that will actually allow us to do that.
Thank you, Robert. Your comments put me in mind of two things. One is you talked a bit about the place of this book in the African-American literary tradition. It would be interesting to think of it in terms of the American-African literary tradition as well, especially some of the more recent fiction writers who have achieved such prominence in the US context and internationally, that there is this kind of interesting shift that could be observed of this narrative. I think I remember one moment where he refers to himself as African-American, several moments where he refers to himself as Black, many moments where he talks about the multiple strands of where he came from. So I think that there's an interesting connection to be made there. Jennifer, did you want to say something? No, okay, sorry. But I did want to ask if the three of you have any thoughts, and this goes back to what you were just saying at the last, Robert. Empathy. One of the things that struck me about this book was that over and over again, we return to these moments where, as Jennifer was describing, and Robert and Steve, I think all of you talked about the moment where he stands in front of the jug-headed graffiti in Egypt that he identifies with, but then also starts to try to empathize with the life of this person. And one of the things I noticed as I was reading the book is that it seems as though for him, empathy is not always a natural response to a situation. That even in that moment, it's a work of labor, and it can sometimes feel a little labored in terms of reading it. It feels like it's an effort. It feels like it's something that you have to practically engage in. And it actually reminds me a bit of Marilynne Robinson's writing. But this sense that at some level, part of the obligation of the sort of citizen, the human being, is to produce that activity of empathy rather than assuming it will just happen. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about where empathy seems to fit in his framework, whether it feels hollow, whether it feels sincere, whether it feels important, or any thoughts you might have about that.
Did I say something?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's I'm glad you brought that up, because I actually felt it didn't feel so labored to me, in the sense that I got the sense from reading the book that he does it almost compulsively, that it was as if, in order for him to do the things that he wanted to do, or to try to get done the things he wanted to try to get done, he felt it was necessary for him to really try as much as he could to understand where people were coming from. Mm-hmm. And so, because he knew that some of his policies would get resistance, and to understand where the resistance originated, he had to understand why people were resisting. And so he tries as much as possible. I think the interesting thing to me, though, is that I feel like you see in the book, and he himself maybe comes to a bit more of this realization toward the end, which is that empathy is, on the one hand, it's necessary, that he sees it as integral to the process of being a human being, but also somebody who tries to govern with different constituencies, but also that it's profoundly limited in a way. It's one thing, he can try to imagine himself into other people's shoes as much as he likes, but at the same time, the people who really need to learn the importance of empathy don't seem to be interested in it, at least, the way that he depicts it in the book. I mean, the people who, when he's trying to figure out the response to the financial crisis, he talks about dealing with all these Wall Street bankers, these fat cats, and they essentially just have no interest. They're just not, interested in understanding how other people are living, how other people are suffering, how their own policies actually had a hand in that. And he finds it profoundly frustrating, but there's nothing he can really do, even if he understands where they're coming from. He can't convince them to develop that skill. And I think for me, actually, one of the things that I found fascinating about this book is that he dedicates it very explicitly at the beginning to young people. I think that I got the sense from reading the book that there's sort of a bit of a civics lesson built in, that he seems to be suggesting to young people, okay, I realize that you have these things that you want to accomplish, that you want our country to look different from, you want it to look differently from the way that it looks now. Well, in order to do those things, let me give you my experience. And you might disagree with how I handled things, but at least you'll get a sense of how I approached these problems. And so I think in a way it's almost an attempt to inculcate, the importance of empathy into a new generation who might at this point be feeling extremely disillusioned, understandably. I mean, young people are, especially people who are graduating now, it's a really, a tough world doesn't even describe it at the moment. And so I think that was another thing that I got from the book, that he really emphasized empathy because he thinks it's essential. If anybody wants to get anything done in a nonviolent way, empathy is crucial.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is that, which I thought was beautiful, actually, Jennifer. The only thing I will add to that is that the takeaway for me from this book is that if you're in a leadership position, be good to your team and don't abandon them when they mess up, because they're going to mess up and you're going to mess up. And where Barack Obama comes off, actually, where he's actually closest to revealing the best parts of his character is in his descriptions of the day-to-day stuff in the White House and the day-to-day stuff in the campaign. He's nice to those people. They talk back to him. He very much is about encouraging sort of, what is the phrase that the Doris Goodwin phrase, a team of equals, a team of rivals, that he's really good in the office. He has good office politics in a way that I'm convinced after reading this work that is necessary for you to get anything done. That's the one thing I thought, oh, I can take this and use this. And that if you're going to be a fine leader, what you have to do is to service the needs of your team. And on that, it's sort of remarkable, and you can see, and he's very good at demonstrating to you how it actually works.
Yeah. I mean, there's also the remarkable moment at the end where he actually talks about the fact that he had to account for the fact that his daily workings were not accounting for the way that the people of color and the women on his staff were actually experiencing things, and that he had to sit down and have a serious kind of rethink of how his environment was organized around him and change it, and ask certain people who were behaving in ways that seemed very normal to them not to do that, and also to check his own machismo, which he uses that word to describe himself, and he seems to think it's important to address that. Steve, did you have a, sorry.
There's a lot of basketball playing in this book, I have to say. There's a lot of guys going to hit the courts.
Yeah, yeah.
No, the only thing I'd say is I agree with absolutely everything that both Jennifer and Robert said. The only thing I'd add, although I think Jennifer said it at the beginning, I think it's very real, and I was convinced it was real. His sense of empathy and his self-deprecation and his self-analysis. It's just that when he writes it, he is analytical. It's just the way he is. And we come to think of sort of an analytical mind and an emotional mind as two different things, but I think he has both, and it's one of his great qualities, that he's able later to articulate what I think are very real emotions. That's my sense of it, but I'm not a literary scholar. I'm a historian. You're all much more expert at that than me, but that's all I can say about it.
Well, on that note, we clearly go on and talk about this for much longer, but we're past our time. And I just wanted to say thank you very much to Jennifer, Robert, and Steve. You've been extraordinary guests. We've been very happy to have you in this conversation. I also want to say thank you to the person who is behind the scenes right now, who is Alice Kelly, who made all the arrangements for this event, put everything together, made sure that the publicity went out, and is a superb scholar in her own right. So thank you, Alice, for putting all of this together. And thank you also to the people who joined us for this conversation. We will look forward to hearing more from you in the future. Please check in the RAI website and join us for another event. We'd be very happy to see you again. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.